Alright, so pull off your positive jump lead, disconnect sensors, or wire harnesses rather, on this, loosen this worm drive clamp. Mine was already loose because I was just doing this, and basically get your air box out of the way. I don't disconnect it here, it's actually just easier to pull it out right from the air intake. Get this whole thing out of the way. That just gives you some more room to work. Go ahead and pull this little cover, or you get a plastic cover off above the AC condenser and radiator. Take this overflow hose from your cooler bottle, just pop it out of the little plastic bracket on the fan shroud, because we are going to move the fan shroud. There's not a ton of room to do this. Alright, so fan shroud's loose, it's ready to come off. We're going to pull off the two bolts, one holding this little rubber tube with the metal spade, the other holding the plastic retaining clip for the wire loom that goes to the fan clutch. Pull those two bolts out, and then we're going to work on getting the fan out. And those are, yeah, E10s. Pretty much everything on here is an E10. There's one E14, and at one point, my method, you're going to use an E12 because it saves you some extra trouble. This is a little tight with the fan in here, but obviously this is part of what you're doing to get the fan out of the way. I've got an impact and an electric ratchet, but all the stuff on here being aluminum, I don't like to use it. At the end of the day, with this kind of project, it's not going to save that much time, and depending on how big your electric ratchet may not even really fit in here very easily. You'll basically see that, and I've got pretty big hands for reference. I'll reach into these small areas like backwards with my hand upside down. Sometimes, like even right here, I'll use my left hand, basically turning away from it, and that lets me reach in there a little bit easier. Now with these two bolts that basically have to do with the fan clutch stuff, I just thread them back in. I believe that they are shorter bolts than the others, so you don't want to mix them up, but I just thread them right back into the mixing chamber, and that way you don't lose them. The other ones I'll put in little Ziploc baggies. Gosh, I can't get it back in there. Ridiculous. There we go. So just get that threaded in a few times so that you don't lose that. And then get the other one out and thread it back in. disconnect the wire loom on this thing, pull it out of the way. So now your fan clutch is ready to come out. So here are the two bolts we just disconnected. That metal spade on that rubber tube is one of the connections. The other one just holds in this wire harness for the fan clutch. So with those out, now we're going to use the special tool to get this fan clutch nut off and pull the fan clutch out. I don't know how well you'll be able to see any of this, but it's just tough to get a good angle. These are the special tools. This is just a 36mm wrench, but it's pretty thin. This is what you need, some kind of special tool. Universal ones don't work. I tried a couple, none of them worked. So this is made to hold the pulley while you're breaking the torque and getting the fan clutch nut off. So I know you probably can't see it, but that's what I'll be doing right now. And to loosen this, you're going to turn the nut clockwise, or turn it overhand towards the driver's side. While using the other tool to hold the pulley. So that was breaking the torque. If you don't have the tool to hold the pulley, you're just going to turn the pulley. I know people say, oh, get a giant pipe wrench, different little tricks. This is, in my opinion, totally inaccessible for anything like that. And the design is such that, again, even those universal like fan clutch holders can't actually hold on to these bolts. I mean, if you're doing this yourself, buy the throttle body on FCP Euro. It's 150 bucks. It's free shipping. They ship really quickly. Plus, they have lifetime warranty on everything. So even if you had an issue where it failed, it's a free replacement. So you can get the part, the actual throttle body, for about 150 bucks on FCP Euro. Get the fan clutch tools I'm using. Also on FCP, they're about 50 bucks. And if you're ever going to have to do this more than once, like I've done, it's absolutely worth having the right tool. Now, I will tell you that this special tool, the clutch holder from CTA, is similar but not the exact same as the Mercedes tool. Alright, so the nut is almost off the thread, so I'm going to go ahead and support the fan now so that it doesn't just thread off and drop. And once it's loose, because the fan shroud is loose, we can work the fan clutch out. Once you break that torque, this is pretty easy to do, but if you've never taken this off, you might have a very difficult time getting the torque breaking the torque on your fan clutch. Okay, so basically now I'm going to work on getting this out using the little bit of maneuverability I've got from the fan shroud. Again, you can take the shroud out if you want, but you'd have to drain some coolant and get the hose off. So now that's out. This will stay here, just loose, but you can work around it. So now when we're ready to pull the mixing chamber off with the throttle body, we'll have the space to move it out and away. You cannot get it out if the fan clutch is there. So I'm going to kind of just drop this down so it's a little more out of the way right now. I'm going to go ahead and pull the Egr bolts. I don't remember the official order of how you're supposed to pull these different components, but I know what's got to come off, so I'm just doing it. So you can hear that fan shroud kind of clicking, banging around, getting in the way a little bit. So the EGR is 4 bolts, and you're not actually removing the EGR, you're just removing the elbow that runs from the EGR to the mixing chamber, which basically is your recirculation pathway. So I'm using a 3-inch extension and the E10. Let me see how, I don't know. Guys, I'm not looking at the camera, so I don't know how well you can see any of this stuff. For the inside most bolt, I'm going to use a 6-inch extension. Actually, no, I'm going to use my 18-inch. That basically lets you get the socket seated directly on that nut, because the extension is smaller than the wrench. Well, I did this before without pulling this hose. I'm going to pull this hose this time because that's the main thing in the way. This is basically trying to do this quickly because I've done it several times now. I could probably do this in well under an hour, I think. If I weren't filming and taking the time to kind of walk through what I'm doing. I don't want to take that off if I don't have to. I'm going to try a universal joint, universal extension. Some of that hardware right there just makes it a little difficult to get straight onto that bolt head. So the universal might be all we need. Yeah, universal is all you need. I'd still use the 18-inch extension because it will make it way easier. Do not drop these bolts. Be extremely careful. That's why I've done this. I pulled my throttle body once to clean it, and ultimately it was still failing, and so it had to be replaced, which is what I'm doing today. I'm actually replacing it with a new OE unit. But when I pulled it off to clean it, I ended up going through this entire process 3 or 4 times because the last 2 bolts that you install from the ground up, pointing upward, are easy to drop. They fell down where I could not get to them without pulling all the stuff back off. So I literally, to do one cleaning of the throttle body, went through this whole process, pulled everything off at least 3, I think maybe even 4 times. So now I'm really good at it. Both flanges on this EGR elbow do have a metal gasket. All the metal gaskets in this process, you're supposed to replace them. I think they're designed to crush a little bit, so they're not really reusable. I reused them before, only because I did not know if the process was just a simple cleaning. So I basically anticipated cleaning it may not work, and I may have to replace it anyway, so I didn't put my new gaskets on yet. I'm actually not going to do that today either, because I'm going to end up pulling the manifolds off and cleaning the entire top end as well as the turbo. So I've got all the gaskets, including these gaskets. So when I do that, I'm going to replace all the gaskets. So I am going to reuse these gaskets today. All right, and so I'll show you just from removing those bolts, you can see this is loose. So this sits in here just like this. And once those bolts are out, you may be able to just rotate it and get it out. I honestly don't remember how I did it before. When I was reinstalling it, I did have to have the bolts and the mixing chamber loose. So I think this technically comes out towards the end. So I'm gonna go ahead and start working on the bolts for the mixing chamber, and then this is already loose. This will pull out once there's a little bit of play in the mixing chamber assembly. So while I've got the camera off the tripod, so coming underneath here, here's your alternator. No, I'm sorry, that's not your alternator. Your alternator's up here. So gosh, you just really can't see it all. This isn't gonna do any good. I'll show you what you have to get to off the van. Hopefully that'll help. But basically you have to come up from underneath. You're gonna move this intercooler hose, and there are 2 bolts you have to get to in here with a long extension that go through a metal bracket that hold the throttle body assembly in place. So you have to take those bolts out and disconnect all the different wire harnesses, as well as those bolts up top where it goes into the manifold, which are those bolts in there again, and then that one E14 right here. Once those are all out, you can pull this away, get this elbow out, and you can work this out with this shroud in place but not installed. So you won't be able to see anything. I'm gonna go ahead and stop filming, but I'm gonna get those lower bolts out and then we'll keep going. Okay, so I've got the 2 E10 bolts out of the bracket that go through the throttle body and the bracket. Those have to be removed because they go through the bracket, then into the throttle body. They're basically what hold the lower end of this whole assembly in place. So now I'm started on these 3 bolts up here. Basically, if you think about these 3 bolts positioning as an upside down triangle, the top right corner and the bottom bolt, those are both shorter bolts, and I get to those with a 6-inch extension. So I fit the extension under that radiator hose that the manual calls to remove and I do not, and I can get to them. The other bolt, which is longer, top left of that upside down triangle, it's like a 4-inch bolt versus a 1.5-inch bolt, just because it has a longer span that it has to run through until the threads start. You can hit that with that 6-inch if you have a swivel head ratchet like this, but the 3-inch extension basically works just as well. Well, not just as well, better. So you can put that on there and get that off. So again, my weird angles, because of not removing everything, I'm a little turning kind of away from the van so that my hand's going in backwards, which allows me to unthread the bolts by hand after I get them pretty loose. So this is top left of that upside down triangle, which is the long bolt. So there's that. Again, if I pulled that radiator hose, I wouldn't have to do these weird angles. I just don't want to deal with the coolant. So that next bolt is not loose enough for me to take off by hand yet. So 6-inch extension under the radiator hose. See. Alright, so I can get that one by hand. So these are the 2 top bolts I'm taking out. Again, especially if you do it this way where you're at weird angles, make sure you've got a good grip on the bolts and you don't drop them. You don't want to have to do this a bunch of extra times like I have. And then lastly is this shorter bolt that's underneath, so the bottom of that upside down triangle, and I'm trying to get to the point where I can just spin the ratchet with my hand to unthread it. Since I've got that extension, it'll make it easier to reach. There we go. Let's get this out of the way. Yeah, there we go. That's nice and loose. So pull that one out. So those are the 3 bolts at the top, 2 bolts at the bottom. And then the next thing we're going to do is jump to no extension E14. Take off this bolt and the center here of the mixing chamber. So there's not a gasket, there's no connection here, it's just basically a mounting point. And again, it's a larger bolt, it's an E14. So all the bolts are E10, except for this one that's an E14. But if you want to do my trick and not take the alternator off, you're going to use an E12 on that one bolt down below, because that little bit of extra play in the socket, it's not so much that it's going to strip it, it's not torqued enough where you're going to do that, but it will seat on that bolt well enough to break the torque and get that bolt out around the alternator. Hopefully that helps, because that is a tricky thing. So now that these bolts are out, I'm going to go ahead and see if I can switch this up. I don't know if you can see it at all. I cannot tell what the camera sees. I'm not really looking at it. So now there should be enough play in this, and if I just back it off some, I can get this EGR elbow out. Yep. Just that little bit of clearance. Grab that gasket on the bottom so I don't drop it. So now that's out. EGR is effectively disconnected. We have to get the wire harnesses disconnected. I think there are 3 of them, and then from there we'll be good to go. All right, hopefully you can see this. I know the light's a little harsh. So here's where the EGR was disconnected, and I've basically pulled this free now. So up here, there's a metal gasket. I don't know if you can see this at all. There's a metal gasket on that flange, and then to the left. So if you look at the black hose in the middle of the screen, on the right side there's a metal gasket, on the left side there's an O-ring. So that O-ring will hold the mixing chamber throttle body assembly. So this whole thing here, it will hold it on just from a little bit of pressure. So you're just going to slightly pull on it and pop it off. And then once you've got some more room down here, you're going to start disconnecting your wire harnesses. So there are 3 to disconnect. One from this sensor here, which is the smaller one of these 2. This larger one is actually on the it's the for the throttle body motor control, which goes into this fitting right here. And it's super hard to get these locking tabs off. It's actually broken on this side of mine. And then there's another one down below that's I'll show you when I get this out, that goes in the plastic, I guess maybe it's an airflow sensor, I'm not sure, but the black plastic fitting that bolts into and through the throttle body into the mixing chamber. So I'm going to set this up on a tripod, and I'll show you how I can get, or how you can get this out with the fan shroud still in the vehicle. Again, it just takes some maneuvering. So now that this is totally free, screwdriver out of the way, you're going to pull up on the fan shroud and you're going to pull it out towards the engine. Just being careful about where it's positioned, not tearing up your AC condenser. Okay, so just like that. So you do not have to remove this. The other sensor I was talking about that you have to unplug is this one right here. So you have 1, 2, 3 wire looms to disconnect on the throttle body assembly, plus that one on the fan clutch. So now that this is off, we're going to take out these bolts, which will allow us to take off this plastic housing, and then access the other bolts to take the throttle body off of the mixing chamber. So I'll do that on the workbench. Okay, so the one place where you do need a 1/4 inch drive most likely is to get this one T25 bolt out of this plastic housing on the throttle body. And then another E10 bolt right there. Now you're going to pull off these 3 bolts, which will allow you to take the actual throttle body off of the mixing chamber. And I think that those are 10 millimeter? Nope, they're 8 millimeters. And support the weight of this, because as soon as these are loose, it'll basically come off like it's, and actually the bolts mostly go through a channel of the throttle body. They only have probably 3/8, maybe a 1/2 inch that they thread into the mixing chamber. So doesn't take much as far as unthreading them. The other thing to make sure you're aware of is the position of the throttle body, because it actually can be, if you don't pay attention, it can be a little confusing figuring out how to line it up when you put it back together. So in my case, the bottom of the butterfly valve, where there's this casting on the throttle body housing, basically is pointing up, as I've got the mixing chamber somewhat pointed down. There's my metal gasket. I'm going to keep oriented in the right position. Get the bolts I just dropped. They're the same, so it doesn't really matter on positioning. So there you go. There's your throttle body removed, ready to be replaced. And mine was in a not where it should have been. So I guess I did in fact have an issue. You also can see the oil in here. You know, you've got some oil flowing through as a result of it being a turbo diesel. When I cleaned mine before, I actually pulled off these clips and pulled off the plastic housing, and I had oil inside of here. This was pretty clean, but as soon as I started spraying and cleaning in here, and breaking up and cleaning that oil, it ran down the shaft through the seal in here and into the actual housing. Probably doesn't make a huge, not a big deal, but just worth knowing that that might happen if you're like just doing some cleaning. All right, so let's get this replaced. Okay, so we have the new throttle body on. Now something else to make sure you pay attention to, not just the orientation of the throttle body. So I talked about this casting at the bottom of the butterfly valve in relation to how I had the mixing chamber positioned, but also where these bolts go, so that when you put on this plastic housing right here, that you're positioned for the bolts correctly, because this only fits on one way as well. And so basically you want to make sure you know how this all goes together. So with this basically positioned about how it goes on the vehicle, which is like this, I know because of this bracket and the locking ring and the wire, gotta get that bolt, and the wire connector for the sensor, that this is going to go on like this. And you can see how this wraps around those bolts. So you cannot put this on the wrong way, because, well, you can't put either of these on the wrong way because it just won't fit. So anyway, I'm going to bolt that back together, put it back in the van, and then as far as what I was talking about earlier, let me show you. So essentially, this is how this whole system is mounted on the van. And those two bolts that I could not show you earlier, as far as taking this off, are these two. So this bolt you can reach from coming from above, and you basically can reach down and get this. This bolt is what I use the next size up socket. So this is an E10 bolt that I use an E12 socket for, with an 18-inch extension, and that will reach past the alternator, right against it, and the intercooler hose. And that slightly larger socket gives you just enough play to get on this bolt and break it free and pull it out and tighten it back in, and you will not strip it. So that's how I get that out without removing the alternator. I've seen some where some people say you have to pull the alternator, but you don't. That's a workaround. And again, those are basically the top and bottom bolts on the back side of this whole assembly, because when this is in the vehicle, it's in the vehicle like that. So I'm going to clean this up before I put it back on, and then reinstall all this, go for a drive, and see if my throttle body and performance issue is now resolved. Okay, so new throttle body is on. We're going to, again, delicately work it through the fan shroud. And the one thing I did not point out is on this fitting, the right side, where there's a flange and metal gasket. Maybe I did mention it, but yeah, there's a metal gasket beside where the O-ring goes. So now this is basically in position. I'm going to carefully set it down there and grab my metal gasket that fell out. Now for this gasket, this is the position that it goes in. So hopefully you can see this, but again, there are two holes, a larger hole and a smaller hole, that have little kind of like locking tabs. So if you consider those, if you pay attention to those go on the left side with the larger hole at the top. And if you ignore that smaller hole with the locking tabs, then you can kind of see that upside down triangle that I was talking about. So anyway, I think these tabs are actually meant to hold this into position on the mixing chamber, but it falls out for me. So I didn't worry too much about it, and if you get the bolts in there, then you'll be fine as far as being able to get it positioned correctly. I'm going to fix this gasket real quick though.